Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
My name is Matt.
And today's episode of the podcast, we are questioning our own reality. Today's films are Dark City from 1998 and Zero Theorem from 2013.
Yes, we've got characters that are questioning the very nature of reality and existence. And they're doing it with virtual realities in the mix as well, of course.
Yeah, luckily for us, because this series is all about virtual reality. A couple of interesting films here. So we've got one by Terry Gilliam, who we talked about previously on the series when we looked at 12 Monkeys on our time travel series, and Alex Proyas. Now, we haven't really come across Alex Proyas before, have we?
No, and I was wondering why I recognised the name, and within 5 minutes of the movie starting, I immediately realised where I recognised the name from. But we'll get into that. Should we get started on Dark City then?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, so as I said, 5 minutes in the film, I was immediately clocking this. I knew the name, I knew I recognised it. And as soon as this film started, I was like, oh, it's the Crow guy.
It's the Crow guy, yeah, that's exactly it. Because that was Alex Proyas' other big film, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the production design, I think he's got the same production designer working on it because it looks near identical. It could be set, the Dark City could be the very city that the Crow is doing whatever the hell it is the Crow does. I can't remember a damn thing about that film apart from what it looked like.
And the other film that we've... so we have talked about Alex Proyas previously on the podcast, which I had completely forgotten about. I can't lie. But when we talked about iRobot, because of course he directed that as well. And again, it's sort of like a similar thing. It's got that kind of like... the way that he builds his cities are quite... They're very imaginative and... They're very visual, aren't they?
Yes, but this doesn't feel like iRobot. You're absolutely right in that he's very good at developing an imaginative visual city for his film, but this is the other end of the spectrum to iRobot, right? Like that, everything's so clean. It's a clean type of future, clean and crisp and neat and smooth lines everywhere and bright. Crucially, very bright daylight throughout most of iRobot.
Yeah, I think with iRobot though, it was just sort of like the scale of the city and just how sort of like detailed it was, because obviously with that film it was all sort of green screened, whereas this it's like sets. They've made these like really big sets to sort of bring this world of Dark City to life. So yeah, they're different sort of styles, but they've still got that sort of fundamental Alex Proyasness about them.
I think so. I do prefer it in this one though. I prefer the use of real stages and sets moving around. There is some CGI in the mix though, isn't there?
Yeah, there's bits of CGI, isn't there, as well, but it's sort of like it's going for that sci-fi noir, that cyberpunk kind of feel, isn't it, with this one? Whereas sort of iRobot, like you said, is very sort of bright and futuristic, whereas this one's a lot more sort of like grounded and sort of dark and mysterious, hence the title Dark City.
Yes. It's a permanently dark city. And I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't realise until one of the characters says out loud that there are no scenes in daylight. But I suppose that does give, that works well for the film because you're just sort of like involved in the story, and maybe I'm just a big dummy, but I sort of had that realisation as a viewer as the characters were having the realisation themselves. So it was it was quite cool in that sense that I was like, oh yeah. Like, I'm not saying like my mind was blown, like you can make a film set at night, but it was nice to suddenly realise like, oh yeah, there actually haven't been any scenes in daylight. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, because they do show like memories of daylight, like John's flashbacks to his apparent childhood. You see bits and pieces like that. But yeah, you're right. It's dark the entire time. And it made me think about Strange Days as well, because that was completely dark throughout the entire thing. And it's such a sort of cyberpunk trait, isn't it? Just having these sort of like these cities which are just constantly in darkness. There's something dangerous about that, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's more in the it's more noir than Strange Days was, even though Strange Days was very much like a noir detective story. It's dialed up even further in this, isn't it? It's set in the past. Say that with quotation marks, I guess.
It's a bit ambiguous, isn't it? Sort of like when it is set, and I think that's deliberate because it's got elements of like 50s and 60s. It's sort of like, it's clear that it's not our present day. It's not the present day of the 90s. It's something a bit different. It's sort of like this amalgamation of lots of different like historical times, but I think it's deliberately made so that you can't properly go, okay, it's definitely the 50s that they're in, or it's definitely sort of like the 40s or whenever. I think it's got that deliberate nature.
Yeah, definitely. And without jumping too much ahead, one of the villain characters does have a line that addresses that directly and says that they've created this city out of like an amalgamation of different time periods, all just mushed together to create their playground city. So that's all deliberate. I did clock quite early on. There's like it has that feel to it. It has that feel of being an undeterminable time and location, but sort of generally the past. There is a scene where Bumstead hands Emma a list of the prostitutes that have been murdered, and it's very clearly on typed paper, but not typewriter paper. It's a word processor. It's printed off a computer. I don't know if I'm like reading too much into it, but it caught my eye because everything was so beautifully done and the production design was so good, and that sheet of paper really stood out to me. Like, that's printed off a computer. They've used like Korean New or like some font to look like a typewriter font, but that is not a sheet of typewriter paper. And my initial reaction was, that's a bit clumsy. But then I sort of got into the whole like, well, it's sort of, I'm not really sure when this is supposed to be set. And then obviously as things develop, that just works because there is no, you don't know if computers exist in this world. You don't know if it could be printed, or it should be from a typewriter or whatever. There's no, the time period's not definitive enough to say that.
Yeah, and you talk about sort of like thinking that part of it might be a bit clumsy when you're watching it. So one of the things which stuck out for me was the editing in sort of like the first half of the film, because there was just something about it which just put me really like off kilter, because they're very sort of sharp cuts and they sort of go around in weird places. They're not sort of like, I don't know what it was, but I found it quite jarring, sort of the first half, just how quickly it would cut in between conversations.
Okay, I think I know what you mean. I think in some of the more actiony scenes, I was feeling that a little bit. When John is chased by the strangers for the first time, that got quite choppy. Do you think that's a deliberate stylistic choice, or do you think that's just not so great editing?
I think it's got to be a deliberate choice because it just seems so sort of like sharp that it shouldn't be there. So I think it's all sort of there deliberately to make you feel a bit ill at ease in this sort of like introduction to the characters, because it starts off with John awakening in this hotel room and he's like covered in blood. There's a dead woman there. So he doesn't know what's going on. And as an audience member, you kind of are left feeling a bit sort of ill at ease. You want to try and figure out exactly why things are making you feel a bit queasy.
Yeah, I think there's something there in the editing about keeping information just outside of the audience's vision and understanding, which is the character's experience of events as well, isn't it? John in particular is just for most of the movie just on the verge of like understanding what's going on, but always scrambling for answers and not quite sure. So yeah, maybe something in the editing there to to restrict information to the audience is an important choice.
So this film also came out a year before The Matrix, didn't it? So I think it was pretty much overshadowed by The Matrix and how well that did. But it's got a lot of similarities as well, hasn't it? Because I mean, we'll get into some of those similarities as we go on with the chat. But what did you think about this as being sort of like of that time period film?
Well, I mean, just to like clarify, I'd not seen this film before, and I absolutely loved it. It was really, really cool and really, really good. But I can see why a film like The Matrix would overshadow it a year later. First of all, it's a better film. You know, that it's just a better film. It's more enjoyable. But it takes some of the themes and styles and look of the film and takes it in a different direction, or it takes it slightly further in the same direction maybe. And I can kind of see how it got a little bit overshadowed there. It also, like, The Matrix is dealing with virtual reality in a much more direct way, whereas I kind of feel like Dark City takes a virtual reality concept and then basically throws aliens in the mix and telekinetic powers and all these other sci-fi concepts. It's fundamentally a virtual world that's been constructed around humans. But it's not like asking a direct question about computer virtual reality in the same way that The Matrix does. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. It's got lots of different like sci-fi concepts, like you said, in there, but it's also lots of different sort of like genres as well, because with this one, it's kind of like that noir detective story, whereas The Matrix is like a kung fu action film. So that's probably part of the reason that they're sort of like, they went off in those two different directions. And obviously kung fu action flicks are going to get a big audience. There's might not be quite as much of an audience for these sort of like noir detective stories kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, totally. There's more mass appeal from an action movie from The Matrix. I mean, Dark City is playing with genre, but the genres that Proyas mixes in are quite niche. So he's got his neo-noir detective story, and then the genre that he's mixing into that is like, I don't quite know how you describe it, but I mean, it's basically The Crow, but it's kind of like fetish club chic sci-fi. How would you describe what the alien characters are like in this?
Yeah, that's a great way to sum it up, because yeah, it's the sort of like the aliens versus machines kind of aspects, isn't it, as well?
Yes, yeah. There's that as well. They're not. No one's plugged into a computer. They are, I don't know, telepathically put to sleep and mind wiped and all this stuff. And it's a bit more. Yeah. It's a bit more biological.
It's biological, that's exactly it. And they've like, the memories of these people in this film are such an important aspect of it as well. So what did you think about sort of like how that played out in the film and how that affected people's identities? Because a lot of this film is about John's own identity and the other characters which live in this city sort of like trying to find out more about themselves. How much was sort of like that down to memory and the way their memories are implanted by the strangers?
Yeah, because the film makes a kind of separation between a human being's set of memories and then what makes them fundamentally a human being. That's what the aliens are interested in, this idea of the soul, which they view as transcendent of memories, I guess, right? There's something biological in these humans that exists and is special and unique, and it's completely divorced from the idea of all of their memories, because their memories are just pulled out and then dumped in another body, and then that body runs off with those memories and continues doing the linear path of storyline that those memories dictate. But something else is in the mix, and that's what's really interesting. I kind of thought it was an interesting take on flipping the inhabitants of a virtual world that we've seen before. Like if we look back to the 13th Floor and World on a Wire in our first episode, where the value of life inside the virtual world was quite low and it could be dismissed quite easily because they were like created life forms. In this film, we're seeing the opposite. They are biological human life, but their humanity is reduced and kind of removed from them. but there's still importance given to them because there are human protagonists. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because it's kind of like, even though they're given these completely foreign memories, it's all about how much of themselves still are there. Yeah, because it becomes about how their memories affect their sense of self, doesn't it? Because they're given all of these memories from other people, and it's whether that changes them fundamentally as humans. Because you've got character, like even the side characters, like the guy who's at the hotel desk, who later becomes the news agent. Like, is he a completely different person with these new memories, or does he have some sense of self still in there?
Yeah, and there's probably the best moment for illustrating this whole concept is, I think it's the first time we really see tuning and really see it take place, when the Goodwins, there's a couple, a family, who are retuned, and they become completely different. They become a completely different social status. So they're having a conversation right before midnight about how the husband is just grinding away at work, and his boss is a bit of a slave driver, basically, and they don't have a very nice flat, and, you know, it's all a bit grim. And then during the tuning, everything just like expands and turns into this really opulent flat with like chandeliers, and the table like quadruples in length into this big banquet table, and then when they awaken, they're basically having the same conversation about the day at work, but he's now talking about the same surname. He's referencing the same surname, but the tables have turned, and he's talking about how he had to let him go, and he's not a very good worker, and he's basically been elevated up the chain at work overnight in minutes, and become a completely different person. But they're interested in how his behaviour will change, I guess.
Yeah, that scene's done so well as well, isn't it? Because like you said, you've got that sort of like the way that the table changes and sort of elongates, and everything in this world is constantly moving and becoming something different. But fundamentally, the Goodwins are still the same people, aren't they? Like you said, they're having that same conversation. It's just there's a slight flip in role reversal, isn't there?
Yeah, and the virtual world allows them to become different people, or become the same people rather, but behaving under a different set of circumstances. They're immediately just placed into a different life, and we see how they might be acting the same, but on the course of a new set of memories.
We're rich, get richer. Probably have maids' quarters before the night is through.
He made a terrible impression for the firm, lollygagging around as he did. So I simply told Fredrickson I was going to have to let him go.
And well, you should have, darling.
Yeah, that moment with the table kind of reminded me of The Matrix again, because like when things change in The Matrix, it's like there's a glitch, isn't it? And it's a bit more sort of like it's a problem. Whereas with this, it's purposefully being done by the strangers as part of this experiment that they're doing with the population of Dark City.
Yeah, so this is the idea of tuning, isn't it? This is a central concept of the film, that the strangers, I was referring to them in my notes as the pale men, because they don't get named as the strangers until quite late in the film, but they're the strangers. The strangers have this ability to tune, and John also has this ability to tune. He's special. He's woken up during a tuning, which is not that uncommon, or not a one-off. Like, other people have woken up. That's a bit of a quirk of their system. But somewhat a human being that can tune is brand new. What did you think of all the tuning as an ability in general? And in terms of like adjusting a VR world as well?
I thought it was an interesting concept, because the fact that they're doing it sort of like via the power of their minds is quite different to... Well, it's not too different to what we've seen in previous films. Like, there's always this character who is able to do that kind of thing and manipulate the world that they're in. But the idea that they're kind of like, the way that they're programming this world is like is a collaboration between all of these aliens, the strangers. And I found like the fact that they use the word tuning as well, because they're trying to sort of like when you're fine tuning a radio or like old school terrestrial TV, they're trying to get to that bit where they've got the perfect picture. So they're trying to create the picture for these people in the city.
I was kind of associating it with tuning a guitar or an instrument and the implications that had for like the way they view the city as some sort of grand work of art that needs to be tuned. Same thing. The concept of fine tuning it, but the more fanciful way that they might see their city. I'm not sure if that was how they saw it, but I thought that it added that in my mind. It gave me that sort of sense of what the tuning meant.
Yeah. And how is it, like, we've seen virtual worlds before, but how is this sort of tuning idea similar to other stuff? Because I mentioned like the Matrix and the glitch sort of stuff. Are there other films which you've looked at which have that sort of similar thing going on?
Well, the one film that it really reminded me of, and it's less about the tuning, I guess, but in terms of the way the virtual simulation was constructed around the characters, was the 13th Floor. So it's really similar to the 13th Floor in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s noir feel of it and scenario. But there's this concept of the characters not being able to go beyond a certain geographical limit, but the way that's enforced is they just simply have no desire to go beyond that geographical limit, and they just don't do it, and it just doesn't cross their minds. And in the 13th Floor, the characters are virtual characters in a virtual world, so they are programmed to not want to do that. In Dark City, it's done telepathically. It's done through the tuning. They simply forbid them from wanting to do that or remembering how to get to certain locations outside of the city.
And it's sort of like it's a physical thing that they can't get past. That they can't get to this fabled place of Shell Beach as well, because they're constantly trying to sort of find the ocean. I mean, that's what John's trying to do a lot of the film, but he can't get there. He can't get out of the city. There's literally no way. All of the tubes and stuff which he goes on in the subway, they don't ever get out. They never reach the destination which he wants to get to. But the other sort of artificial nature of it, which I was thinking about as well, is the fact that all of these names for places are very sort of generic, aren't they? Because the whole world seems really artificial. So like it's Shell Beach, isn't it? The place where he wants to get to. But then the Barbers is just called the Barbers. And there's other places which just have like their names are what they are. So it's done by you can tell it's done by this alien race that don't really know exactly what they're creating. They're kind of a bit sort of like separated from it.
Yeah, and it's all just guesswork from the mix and match of memories that they've just hoovered out people's brains and then just like splattered down on a canvas, and the city is the result of that. I really like that concept, and what that leads to is these sort of tantalizing snippets of images like the postcard of Shell Beach. Now that shouldn't be there because it just leads the characters to investigate it and want to know what Shell Beach is, which is a place they can't go. But there's billboards for it. John has a postcard of it. There's imagery of it all around, and all the characters are aware dimly of what Shell Beach is, even though that is kind of inconvenient to the stranger's plan. But they don't have that complete 100% control of their constructed reality, do they? Because they are at the whims of the mess of memories that they've extracted.
Yeah, because it all comes down to like the purpose that they're doing this for, doesn't it? Because the strangers are trying to figure out what it is about humans that make them what they are. So they're doing this sort of like mass experiment to try and figure out, they're sort of like searching for what the purpose of individuality is, isn't it? Because they work as like a hive mind. So they all think the same way. They are like the same entity for all intents and purposes. And like the explanation for exactly what they are is brilliant as well, because they're all like, they're dead people's corpses, which have been reanimated by weird squid-like creatures, which live in the brains.
Yes. Yeah. It unfolds in a really satisfying way. Like I said, I hadn't seen this film before, but I was a bit apprehensive that knowing that we were doing it for our VR series was going to be a big spoiler. But it's not like that. It isn't one of those films. It unfolds in a really interesting way. You kind of know you're dealing with aliens pretty early on, because if they're not aliens, what the fuck are they? but the actual nature of exactly what the aliens are, that's held back for quite a long time. You see some pretty like gangly, weird tentacles coming out of one of their heads early on, but it's not clear what's going on until later in the movie. Yeah, like you said, what did they do? Did they abduct a whole mass of people for this experiment and then just killed a few of them for them to use as their interactive vessels?
That's kind of what it seems like. It's very ambiguous as to exactly how they ended up where they are in the Dark City. So they kind of like leave quite a lot to your own imagination. But that's kind of like what I got from it. Like it seems to me that they've been abducted and they're now living in the city. And it's something about sort of like the strangers are trying to figure out what the individuality is in humans and sort of searching for this sort of idea of the soul, because they need it in order to survive, because they're dying out, aren't they?
Yeah. Do they give a reason for that, or is that left also kind of vague? They're just dying for some reason.
I think, again, it's quite vague. You just sort of get the hint at it. And I think that's kind of what Proyas is going for. He kind of like, he doesn't want to give you a film where you know all the answers straight away. He's sort of like telling you little tidbits, but you kind of have to connect the dots.
Yeah, and that includes really getting a good look at what the aliens are. We see this kind of gelatinous slug come out of the head sometimes, but it's kind of translucent. It never looks fully corporeal. I didn't feel like I didn't come away from it knowing exactly what these aliens looked like at all. Did you?
No, they kind of like leave that, don't they? But like the physical manifestation, like they're all sort of bald guys with pale faces and sharp teeth, aren't they? Like that's how we see them. But obviously they've got these weird little squid slug things in their heads. But they also reminded me of the gentleman from Buffy.
Totally. Yeah. That was that immediately as soon as they came on screen, I was reminded of the gentleman. They're very scary, but they're uncanny, aren't they? They look human but not human. And that's what's so very scary about the gentleman. It's even more so in Buffy because of the silence, that kind of other uncanny element that they add to it in Buffy. But in this, they are similarly weird and creepy and unnatural and unusual. And throwing in the child one really adds to that as well.
Mr. Sleep.
Is that his name? How did you feel about Mr. Sleep, James? Because I don't know if we've talked about this on the show before, but I know that you love a creepy child.
Creepy ghost children are not something which I like to see in any film. They scare the absolute crap out of me. Like, Mr. Sleep was creepy. And like I was looking it up afterwards, and apparently the actor was played by a boy, but then he would switch with his twin sister, like for a double, because obviously kids can only work for set amount of times on film sets. So they would switch them out. But apparently they were both really excited to be in the film and loved getting dressed up in these sort of like weird costumes to play this character. But Mr. Sleep was just a weird one in general, because like it's the only child stranger, which was a bit off-putting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it just works, doesn't it? It works for the tone of the film. And the explanation works as well. I just assumed it was a young one of the aliens, but it will be a young abductee who's died, and they've chosen Mr. Sleep for whatever reason, decided he'd take that body for his host. So
talking about Mr. Sleep, him and Mr. Hand are kind of like, Mr. Hand being the one who's played by Richard O'Brien.
Amazing.
Gotta say, love seeing Richard O'Brien in any film. I was like, when you were saying that they had this sort of like, they're uncanny and they're sort of like half human, half something else, I was just thinking, Richard O'Brien, that's him, perfect role.
That's his wheelhouse. He's not in enough films, is he?
No, but he did so many episodes of The Crystal Maze as well. I mean, we've got that, haven't we?
Yeah, his magnum opus. Yeah, it's always there.
What is to be done? This man is dangerous.
It is said he is able to tune.
Impossible.
We have seen it with our own eyes.
On occasion, the imprinting does not take. They behave erratically when they awaken.
We find them wandering like lost children. But this one was different, yes?
What has the doctor to say about this?
He has failed to report in.
And Mr. Quick?
No more Mr. Quick. Mr. Quick, dead. Yes.
But talking about Mr. Hand and Mr. Sleep, they're kind of different to the other strangers. Like, for me, that's how I viewed them anyway, because they're both sort of like, they're supposed to be this big hive mind and they're not supposed to have any sort of real agency, but both of those characters kind of get a bit of individual behavior and a bit of individuality, because Mr. Sleep, there's the moment when him and the other strangers are going after John near the big sort of like billboard poster, and he looks like he's happy to be getting the chance to kill John. Like, he pulls out a knife and he like bites his hand and he's sort of like acting a bit sadistic, isn't he? And that felt like a bit more of an individual behavior as opposed to the other strangers.
Yeah, it's more directly explained in Mr. Hand, isn't it? Because Mr. Hand, these identities that they shift around are called imprints, and they can be injected with a syringe, and then you get your new personality straight to the brain. But they also have the ability to imprint themselves. So Mr. Hand has borrowed the John identity in an effort to try and track John down when he's on the loose. So that's the kind of overt explanation for why Mr. Hand seems much more unique compared to his stranger counterparts. But you're right, Mr. Sleep is particularly cruel and sadistic and violent to slightly more of a degree than the others. I did wonder if there was like an element of what we see in the first Matrix, in all the Matrix films, with Smith's developing persona as he's in the Matrix, this separation from the collective hive mind that allows an individual development in an otherwise hive mind brain. Like you just said, we see so little of the alien culture that it's all just there. You've got to just infer it for yourself. What was bubbling away in my brain was that, like, we've got this like colony of strangers. I assumed this doesn't represent the entire population of strangers. This is an experiment to save their race. But how long have they been separated from their hive mind? And what is the psychological effect that it's having on them? And they're spending all this time with these, to them, weird, unique, singular humans. Is it rubbing off on them? Is it making them a little bit different from the hive mind that we're explained is their default state?
Yeah, it could be that at the point we sort of like see them in the film, they are sort of like beginning to evolve like they say John has done, because John develops this sort of like tuning ability, which we don't know how long John or anybody else has been in this sort of like dark city. We don't know how long they've been there. So it could have been a really, really long time that they've just been floating around.
Yeah, I think, does Kiefer Sutherland put a number on it at one point as to how many lifetimes John might have had? But that doesn't give any sense of actual time, because I got the impression that someone could be imprinted and then live that life for ages, and someone else might be imprinted and just live that life for a few nights before they change their mind and stick another personality in them.
Yeah, because they're not very specific about any of the timings. But like you said, this whole idea of imprinting people overnight is really interesting as well, because they kind of like abduct them again. They just completely switch their surroundings, switch who they are. Like with the Goodwins, they turn them into different people with different memories, but they still sort of like have their own sort of like personalities coming through. And like John is sort of like the prime example of this, because they try to turn him into this killer, this person who's killed all these prostitutes, but for whatever reason he doesn't believe it. And like, obviously he has broken out the tuning, but he kind of knows in himself that he's not a killer. So it's kind of like he tests himself to try and figure out if these are his memories or not. So it's interesting sort of like seeing that happen in the film as well, and the sort of like the whole abduction thing that's going on.
Yeah, I love that scene. Again, in the first like major tuning scene, that sense of abduction is, you see them like they're just like hauling bodies around like over their shoulders and like popping them in a chair. Like they've got their little background alleyways that the strangers can access through tuning, and they come out of one just carrying the guy that they slap into the chair in the barber shop. And you just get no explanation of where he's come from. I love this idea that they've just got bodies like in storage. They just keep asleep until they're like, right, let's have a go at a guy in a barber chair and see what we can do with it. The reduction of personal identity is to such a degree that they can just haul a body out of storage when they fancy one of their experiments to see what a certain personality will be like. And that's something that you can do in a VR film, because the reality can just be put on pause, and so can personality and lived experience. It can all just be paused. These characters are treated the same way programs are in other VR films, aren't they?
Yeah, because again, they're sort of like, they're taking the role of a different character. They are being that person for all intensive purposes, but it's not the same as like when you're taking control of an avatar in, say, like other virtual reality films. They're not aware of who they really are, but it's sort of whether who they are in their souls sort of like permeates through this person that they've been told that they are. If that makes sense. I'm getting really sort of like crazy and philosophical here.
Yeah.
But I think it has a lot of philosophy elements in it, doesn't it? Because it's this whole idea of what is the self and all of that kind of stuff, which again, I'm probably not as well equipped as I should be to go into those deeper things, but it's all there, isn't it?
Yeah. And John becomes that messiah character that we've seen in other VR films, and we're going to see the year after this in The Matrix. John is essentially the one, isn't he?
Yeah, definitely. We've got yet again another sort of godlike presence in a sort of virtual reality. And he's sort of like bestowed, he gets all these powers, doesn't he? Which he can do all the tuning stuff that the strangers can do. So in the same way as Neo gets the powers to manipulate the Matrix, we've got John, who is able to manipulate the Dark City. And it's sort of, it goes down the same route, doesn't it?
Yeah, he can see the code. He can see the code of the Dark City. It's just done in this more biological concept.
See, I've been trying to remember things, clearly remember things from my past. But the more I try to think back, the more it all starts to unravel. And none of it seems real. It's like I've just been dreaming this life, and when I finally wake up, I'll be somebody else. Somebody totally different.
And as with The Matrix, you've got sort of in The Matrix, you've got the whole amazing bit where Neo is downloaded with Kung Fu, and then he suddenly knows Kung Fu and things like that. Whereas in this one, you've got John who's given an injection of memories from Kiefer Sutherland's character, which basically tells him all he needs to know about tuning in the space of like no time at all. So he gets all of that knowledge from that one injection.
I absolutely loved that scene, and I thought it was way better than the Kung Fu downloads in The Matrix. It was such a clever way of doing it. We understand the concept that memories are able to be, put in a syringe and injected. We understand that, and we accept that as the premise of the film. But then the way you actually see it playing out, a rush of memories, which is, a standard cinematic trope to put on in a montage with an effect, so it's not it's separated from reality, but to have his character kind of narrating through that in a kind of meta way and saying stuff like, you're probably wondering why I keep popping up in your memories. It's because I've implanted them. You need to remember to be a superhero, or whatever he says. Like, I just loved that whole scene. I thought it was such a great way of just rushing John into that messiah role and giving him all his superpowers really, really quickly at the end for the final battle.
Yeah, because I know we haven't really touched much on Kiefer Sutherland's character like Dr. Schreiber, but he is like, it's not your typical Kiefer Sutherland character, is it? Because like he is quite eccentric, and just his mannerisms and sort of like the weird little voice he puts on. What did you think about that? Because obviously when he's injecting himself into the memories of John, you get all of that stuff there, don't you, as well?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I feel like Kiefer Sutherland, he did used to do a bit more of the eccentric roles before he became the terrifying fascist badass of the world of 24, and now he's kind of like a bit like Liam Neeson, like will just now be an older badass for the rest of his career. And Kiefer Sutherland is also now stuck being the middle-aged to aging badass. But he's got those chops to do these more eccentric characters. And he's brilliantly creepy. He doesn't play the Morpheus or Einstein role of the person who's aware of the simulation. He's he's more devious than that, and you don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. He's not there to like show up and save the protagonist and be like, I'm going to explain everything. He's actually antagonistic for most of the film.
Which cut did you watch of this, out of interest?
I watched the director's cut on the recommendation of one of our followers on Twitter. What about you?
Yes, I did exactly the same thing, because I had seen the theatrical cut before, but I didn't realise. So apparently in the theatrical cut, which I'd completely forgotten about, Dr. Schreiber does like a big voiceover where he sort of like narrates he explains what the strangers are doing and the basic premise of the film. So I think that like obviously takes away from the enjoyment of watching it for the first time. You kind of like, you want to find this out as the characters do. So having that sort of direct explanation sort of takes away all of that, doesn't it?
Yeah. So what's he doing in the theatrical cut? Is he like, I live in a city where space aliens manipulate our memories?
I bet it's exactly the same. In fact, I'm going to try and find that, and then I'm going to cut it in right here.
First, there was darkness. Then came the strangers. They were a race as old as time itself. They had mastered the ultimate technology, the ability to alter physical reality by will alone. They called this ability tuning. But they were dying. Their civilization was in decline. And so they abandoned their world, seeking a cure for their own mortality. Their endless journey brought them to a small blue world in the farthest corner of the galaxy. Our world. Here they thought they had finally found what they had been searching for.
And now we know. So after that big fight scene that's kind of crazy, it's like Akira. I thought it was pretty cool.
Definite Akira vibes. I didn't think about that, but yeah.
Well, it's all psychic power fights, isn't it? I thought they did a good job. That's a difficult thing to put on screen, and I thought they did a good job here.
Yeah, like lots of smashing through stuff. Again, it's like the end of Matrix Revolutions.
It was a bit with the flying fight scene. But after that, we move into this totally idyllic ending. And again, I was totally reminded of the 13th floor. We've got this everything's okay ending. How did it make you feel?
It was nice. You got to see the sun. Like John's kind of like, he's got full control of the Dark City now. He's defeated all of the strangers. He's like, also like the fact that the strangers are like basically allergic to water, like in Signs. Sort of like, so there's no water anywhere. But yeah, so it's like the fact they're by the sea, just like the 13th floor, and they've got like the sun, and it's just like walking into the sunset is pretty much how it ends, doesn't it?
Yes, and I feel like it works a bit better than some of the other idyllic endings that we've seen, because the way this differs from other VR films is there is no stepping out of the virtual realm. It's just understanding the virtualness of the world you're in and then taking back control of it. So I don't think we've really seen a virtual world where the virtual inhabitants take control. Oh, I mean, Tron. It's a little bit like Tron, where everyone's aware that it's a virtual world and they've taken over. And that's essentially how we get a happy ending there, because it doesn't leave any open questions. We're not like, oh, but what about how real is this world? We know it's not real, but the inhabitants have taken control.
Yeah, because I don't think we've actually mentioned, but the world itself is just a floating spaceship, sort of a bit akin to Discworld almost. Like it's just floating around in space. It's just this flat city, just with some sort of like, I don't know, must have some sort of shield over it or something, but they've got their own atmosphere and everything. But it is just essentially a flat space, which like, that's it for the world. That's as far as it goes.
Yeah, and I because I'd never seen it before, I had no expectations for how it was going to end. But I love the fact that we just stay in the Dark City, and we've overthrown the overlords, but we're still floating in space, and no one's got any idea where they're originally from. This just becomes this new society that's, well, I mean, they've got like a god on Earth in the form of John, whether they're going to know that or not, but they're just going to live out forever now on this floating city.
In the light city. So another city that is full of lights and bright colours and things like that is the city we're looking at next. It's in the world of Theorem. Terry Gilliam's film from 2013. Let's have a little bit of a chat about that.
We always wanted to feel different, unique. Objective analysis, however, concluded that we are but one in many single worker bees.
Everyone's getting rich, except you.
What seems to be the problem?
We are dying.
Who's we?
Us. Ourselves.
There's only one of you.
So it would appear.
Right, Quinn, how's it hanging?
It isn't hanging at all well.
Eh? Sorry.
A fear of death, fear of life, fear of open spaces, fear of people.
We fear nothing most of all.
Are you trying to be difficult?
Been handpicking talent to crunch it since before I was hired. Nobody laughs. It's a guaranteed burnout project. Zero Theorem. All very hush-hush.
Zero must equal 100%. Good luck.
I give him 2 weeks.
So this is another film that I had not seen before this. Had you seen the Zero Theorem, James?
No, and I was praying that it had some sort of virtual reality in it because I was not sure if it did when we watched it.
Yes. Yeah, it's another one of these films where we get a little bit nervous that we've picked the wrong film. But no, it's got a big VR element. It becomes an important thing for the main character and his kind of interactions with the world. And it's a film that is all about his ability to interact with the world, isn't it?
Yeah, and it fits in well with this theme we're looking at today because questioning reality is like the whole basis for it as well. Because you've got this character of Cohen, who is having a bit of an existential crisis throughout, isn't he? He's not he's not at home in the world that he's living in. And there's lots of stuff which is contributing to that fact. But the film, again, is a Terry Gilliam film. We've looked at Terry Gilliam previously. We looked at 12 Monkeys. And it's kind of got that real Terry Gilliamness to it, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a Gilliam dystopia. Same as the future world that Bruce Willis comes from in 12 Monkeys, although a smidge less depressing than that. And it's probably most similar to the dystopia in Brazil, right? It feels very similar to the world he created there.
Definitely. And it's kind of become sort of Gilliam's sort of trademark, this kind of like weird, quirky, future kind of dystopian society that he creates in his films. And I know that Gilliam was asked, is this kind of like part of a trilogy? Because 12 Monkeys and Brazil are being so sort of similar in sort of like the stylistic elements and sort of what they're talking about in the films. Would this be sort of like the third part in that trilogy? Gilliam said, no, this is just how I like to make my films.
Yeah, that's kind of an unfair question to ask, isn't it? Because the question is loaded and it implies that when he made Brazil, he was like, I'm going to do 3 films with this feel, and that will in itself mean something. He has a way of creating films in this style, and that's all he's done. And there's certainly no crime in that. And you don't sit Quentin Tarantino down and be like, "Oh, you've made another violent film. Is this part of your violent film series?" Like, it's just that's the style.
Exactly. Like Gilliam is an auteur, isn't he? He knows what he wants. Sometimes that doesn't always come to fruition in the films, and he's very open about his criticism of sort of the film industry in general. We talked about that previously. What I've heard him do interviews about this film, and he said Christoph Waltz, he had to have someone like Christoph Waltz because he needs a bankable star in his films. So he was thinking about that. And I mean, I think Ewan McGregor was thrown out at one point to play the character of Cohen, and Billy Bob Thornton, but like it came down to Christoph Waltz, and I think Christoph Waltz is brilliant in this. He does such a good job of playing this character and sort of like showing all of the weirdness and the sort of like the emotions that he's going through. I think he does a really great job.
Yeah, he's really good in this. And I think Melanie Thierry is very good in it as well.
Definitely. It has got bankable stars, hasn't it? Because Tilda Swinton is also in it as well, and you've got Matt Damon. So like the cast is strong, but it doesn't take away from the Gilliamness of it, because none of these actors are playing characters who you would sort of identify them with.
Yeah, apart from Tilda Swinton, who can play anything and everything and is doing that with aplomb in this film. And And even like some of the background characters, I think like there's the scene where he's applying for disability leave and he's got to speak to a panel of doctors at work, and it's Sanjeev Bhaskar, Peter Stormare, and Ben Whishaw. Like where else? Who else but Terry Gilliam could pull together those three people to sit on a surreal panel of doctors for just a 5-minute scene?
And it kind of like that scene in particular kind of like sets up Cohen's character as well, because he's not at home, like we said, he's not at home in the world that he's living in. He wants to just work from home. He wants to do what everyone's been doing for the past like year or so because of the bloody pandemic. But he really wants that. He wants to be sort of in his own world doing what he wants.
Yes, and it's very relatable, isn't it? Because he's insisting that his productivity is higher and he will work better if he can just do his job from home. And there's no point in wasting time commuting because he's just going to sit in an office and ignore his co-workers and get on with his job. And I was like, this guy's making some good points.
But like their office as well is really strange because it's like there's a lot of computer game elements in this because the thing that he's doing is basically a computer game. He's like taking information and then putting it in sort of like this big computer to sort of do what it's doing. He's not quite sure what it's doing, but he's kind of like the first thing he's on has got like pedals. So he's like pedaling at the same time as controlling this game. And he sort of like goes up and down. And it is like a game because someone keeps popping out of a hand and dropping little tubes of like different liquids that he has to load in. So it's really weird.
Yeah, it very deliberately defies understanding in the way that any of it works. He's ostensibly completing formulas, but the reason for it is very mysterious, and the actual process of what he's doing. Like you said, he's filling up a tube of data and then handing it over, but it involves pedals for some reason.
Yeah. The pedals thing's really funny as well because someone was telling me recently that they were in a Zoom call with their boss and they were showing them this weird little pedal thing they had underneath their desk. So obviously everyone's working from home at the moment and everyone's worried about sort of like getting fat and not getting exercise. So what they've got is like a little kind of like bike almost where they can just pedal during the day whilst they're on Zoom calls and doing their Excel spreadsheets. Absolutely mad.
Right, so well, it's keeping Cohen fit then, I guess, the job, the crunching
that way.
Crunching entities. And that's the other thing as well. He makes a point of saying that he's not crunching numbers, he's crunching entities. But like, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, we don't really exactly know what the entities are, do we? It's kind of like a bit vague. And we know just as much as Cohen does at that point, don't we? That his job is to be a bit of a worker drone and enter stuff into this system for whatever purpose it is.
And he's particularly good at it compared to his colleagues. So he wants this meeting with the doctors to get disability leave to wait at home for his phone call. And he's told that he can't do that because he's got too much work on, but he's able to still do it because he's way ahead of schedule. He's so good at crunching these entities and pedaling his pedals and filling up his little tubes that he's way ahead of his workload and can go to this meeting with the doctors.
Like you said, like he wants to go to this meeting because he wants to work from home, because he realizes he thinks he's going to be more productive at home, but also the world around him is quite a lot to deal with because when you're first shown the moment when Cohen goes out of his front door to go to work and do the commutes, it's such a sensory overload that you get from all of the images that are sort of attacking him from all angles. There's like an advert which follows him as he's walking and it's just blaring stuff at him. And there's all these sort of like bright neon signs. It's very sort of like we said, like it's Gilliam's kind of style, and it's kind of got his humor as well because it's got this my favorite thing was Batman the Redeemer, like the Church of Batman the Redeemer. So everything's kind of like stylized and commercialized in this sort of like this weird city that he's put these characters in, but it's also very relatable because everything can be got at the flick of a switch. So like he does deliveries just quickly on his phone, or his like, I don't think he does it on his phone, but he does it like on his computer. Things are getting delivered, things are happening. There's always stuff going on in this world. So it's quite a lot for Cohen to be dealing with.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of sci-fi worlds that we've seen. but it has that Gilliam stamp on it and the humour and all of that, like you said. Like, it really reminded me of Minority Report when Tom Cruise is just wandering around the city and he's kind of assailed by adverts that are addressing him directly and he can't, like, get away from it. And I couldn't help but think, like, oh, what would Minority Report have been like if Gilliam had done it? He could have done a really interesting version of Minority Report and his spin on that particular dystopia.
Yeah, definitely. It's always interesting to think about what other directors would do if they were given that kind of material. But I think you're right. He would have thrown all of that at Minority Report as well.
Yeah, I think any futuristic dystopic film would have scope to be directed by Terry Gilliam. I mean, I think he could do a really interesting take on pretty much any film that's set in a dystopian future.
What seems to be the problem?
We're dying.
Who's we?
Us. Ourselves.
But there's only one of you.
So it would appear.
The subject has undergone 5 physicals the last year. He's healthy as a horse.
Our hair has fallen out.
Perfectly normal.
According to your file, you're the most productive number cruncher in your unit.
Entity crunchers. We work with esoteric data that have a life on their own.
So earlier you mentioned that Cohen is having an existential crisis. In what way is that happening to him?
Well, he's kind of like, he's become obsessed with two things. So one of the things is that he is dying, and he doesn't refer to himself as a he is a we. So he's kind of like, he is like, he considers himself like an embodiment of everyone almost. So in the way that he refers to himself. So directly in terms of the audience, watching it as an audience member, Cohen is supposed to be like us, like anybody who has a job and is like working and going about their lives. But the existential crisis really comes in with this fact that he thinks he's missed his chance. He's missed his call in life. Literally, he missed a call which happened one day. He picked up, but he didn't answer it, or he didn't like talk back at the right time. So he doesn't know his purpose in life, and he's obsessed with that. He is obsessed with finding out what he's there for, what he's supposed to do. He thinks he has this big grand calling, but he doesn't know what it is, and that's affecting every element of his life.
Yeah. So he's hitting on 3 points. He thinks he's dying. He wants to find meaning in his existence and thereby all existence. And he's lost his sense of identity. Is that it, I guess? Like he has no individual singular sense of identity, and his boss won't even address him by name. He seems to be insistent on calling him the wrong name, Quinn. So he has no sense of self. He's hitting like 3 big existential points, isn't he?
Definitely. And it's kind of like similar to Dark City, because that was so much about finding out about personal identity and what it is that makes someone who they are. These are all the things which Cohen is trying to figure out, but he just doesn't have he's not equipped to do so.
And I think that this might be where having Christoph Waltz on board is so important, because apart from being a bankable star, he's an incredible actor. So communicating all of that to the audience while still maintaining a likable on-screen presence. He's not aloof. He is a little bit aloof, but not in an unpleasant way. He's very likable. He's kind of innocent and sweet, and seems younger than Christoph Waltz in his like sort of developed naivete.
Yeah, and you go along the sort of journey with him, don't you? Like, you find that Cohen does change through his experiences with other people as the film continues, because when it comes down to it, there's not a lot of sort of big action scenes or anything like that in this film. I mean, there's nothing like that. It's very much all dependent on Christoph Waltz's performance and his interaction with the other actors, because the majority of it does just take place in his home, in this sort of like church where he lives. And I think that's another important element, the fact that it is a church and he's looking for his calling. So it's kind of got that religious backdrop to it as well. Like he is looking for purpose through his faith in this call.
Yes, within all of this existential crisis that he's having, he has maintained an absolutely committed and dedicated faith in the idea that he will receive a phone call at some point that will tell him what the meaning of life is, or what the meaning of his life is.
And of course, he is offered this chance to get this phone call, seemingly by the character of Management, who is played by Matt Damon. So Matt Damon puts Christoph Waltz Cohen on this project called the Zero Theorem. And again, it's very mysterious. He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what he's doing, but he knows that he's going to get the chance to work from home. So that's kind of like the big draw for him.
Yeah, it's essentially the same job, but harder. He's going to continue to crunch entities, but he can never seemingly keep up with the amount of work that he's being asked to do. And there's this unattainable target, which is that 0 must equal 100%. Everything must be nothing. And he can never get it above, like, it's like 93% when he starts working. He gets it to like 97%, but it's destroying his mind just trying to get the data they need to prove this theorem.
Yeah, and like that's again when the virtual reality kind of stuff comes in to a degree, because the way that he is interacting and doing his job is sort of like virtual reality. He's gaming almost. And the fact they've made it like a game, the fact he's got a controller and he's doing all of this number crunching, but it's like he's flying cubes across the screen to sort of get into different blocks and things like that. He is obsessed with that sort of virtual world and completing this task. You see like an entire year go by when he's working on this Zero Theorem project, and it goes by in the blink of an eye because he's so obsessed with this task that he's doing.
Yeah, he's much more comfortable interacting with his kind of video game work life. Because he's so awkward, he can't like go to a party, he doesn't know where to stand, you know, he hates being around other people because he's lost this ability to interact with people from whatever sort of personal crisis that he's had, which is hinted at later in the film in dialogue. But he's much more comfortable with that, and that's how he begins to then grow, I guess, a little bit as a character, because he develops this relationship with Bainsley, who's a woman he meets at that party he's awkward at, who offers him this opportunity to interact in a full VR world. So more than just playing this game and staring at the screen, she's going to give him like this whole interactive suit that will allow him to play in a VR world. What did you think of the actual get-up that he had to wear to enter that VR?
Oh, I thought it looked hilarious. Just seeing Christoph Waltz in this sort of like weird red spandex with this weird sort of it's got like a bit on the top that makes him look a bit like a court jester, which is where the plug is. It's hilarious. And the fact he's sort of like he's struggling to get it on it's just a brilliant scene to watch.
Yeah, I thought he looked a bit like a Christmas elf. But he goes into that. So he has this awkward encounter with Bainsley. He has lots of awkward encounters with Bainsley and everyone else. But she's, for some reason I couldn't quite understand, she's determined to stick with him. Or is the reason that it turns out she's paid to do that by management?
So it does turn out that she's being paid by management to sort of keep an eye on him and get him to sort of keep doing the Zero Theorem project.
But keep him sane, basically. And I think that management's idea is that she's going to be a prostitute. I think that she's hired for that reason, but she doesn't actually want to do that. I think it's hard to tell exactly where the lies end and the truth starts, I think, with Bainsley, but it seems genuine that she doesn't like sex in the real world and she doesn't want to do that, but she does develop real feelings for Cohen. So she's sent to just cheer him up and be a pretend girlfriend for him, but she actually wants to do that in real life. Well, not in real life, but through the VR connection that she can make with him. And that's the offer that she gives him.
Yeah, and they have this whole sort of relationship in this VR world, don't they? And again, it's kind of like this idyllic scene. It's on a beach. There's like the sun, and they're sort of like they're having this lovely time in this virtual reality. And again, Cohen is getting obsessed with that. He sort of replaces his work for being obsessed with that sort of perfect world and that perfect life with Bainsley.
Yeah, he's got more confidence there. He's got a full head of hair. He's tan and he's just having a nice time eating lobster and going swimming. But even that goes wrong for him, doesn't it? He nearly drowns the first time he goes into the virtual sea.
Yeah, he's still got all this sort of baggage, and they do this sort of like role reversal as well, where Bainsley says, okay, well, you show me your sort of like vision of the world so I can see sort of what your virtual reality would be like. And it's just this void, isn't it? endless void and he's floating around naked in space.
Yeah, he gets control of the VR simulation and turns it into something absolutely nightmarish that Bainsley is terrified of, and he immediately loses control of, and he's sucked into that terrifying force.
Whereas sort of like Bainsley's world is sort of it's so nice and sweet, and it's kind of like what you would want, that idyllic like summer holiday. So it's a complete contrast to the way that Cohen is like feeling about life. So they've got these different sort of views on the world, but also like Bainsley's world has that sort of seedy element to it as well, because like you said, when Cohen enters her site, it's very much like going onto some sort of porn site where he's going to watch live cam girls or something, because like she's got that, yeah, it's just like enter here and all this kind of stuff. It's all set up to be a bit smutty, isn't it?
Yeah, but she's allowing him this like special access because she says specifically come on the website at midnight exactly. So she's giving him this like preferential treatment, and it's then like an awkward moment when he logs on, because like you said, he becomes a little bit addicted maybe to the VR simulation. He wants to go back and experience it again, but that means he goes on at the wrong time when she's doing her public performance on the website, and that suddenly becomes like really awkward and uncomfortable because he's seeing the side of her that she didn't want him to see.
Yeah, and it's like, again, we're seeing virtual reality used for escapism, but that escapism is to do with sexuality and sort of like sexual escape. We've seen it in sort of Brainstorm. We've seen it in other films where people are using virtual reality for this kind of pleasure.
But I think in Zero Theorem for Cohen in particular, there is a more emotional element to that, because it's not just sex for Cohen. It's a real human connection that he's been completely unable to experience in the real world for years, seemingly. He hints at having a wife. He just mentions it in one sort of throwaway line that he was married and then divorced. We don't know if that's the emotional crisis that led him to, completely withdraw from society. But he had something there. He had a human connection at one point that he's lost. And the VR relationship with Bainsley allows him to feel emotions again and feel connected to another human being.
Yeah, so that's why it's such a shock when he sees Bainsley being a cam girl, basically, when he logs in at the wrong time. And because they built up that emotional connection, because this is an emotional connection he can't build in real life, it's kind of like all of his baggage and all of the stuff he's sort of constantly dwelling on just isn't there when he's in this free world with Bainsley, because they can create their surroundings. They can make it how they want to be. They can make it a safe environment. And Cohen is all about being in sort of like a safer environment the whole time. Like, he wants to work from home. He doesn't want to be commuting and stuff. He wants to be in his own space where he can control the things around him and sort of like wait for that moment when he knows what he's supposed to do, that phone call, which he's constantly waiting for.
One night, a long time ago, we were awakened by the phone ringing. We picked it up, and a voice on the other end said, "Cohen left." Before we could respond, we felt this great yawning maw of power opening through the phone line. We felt a sudden rush of joy, unlike anything we've ever felt before. And we knew quite clearly that we only had to answer yes, and the voice would tell us the meaning of our life. The voice would tell us our special calling. The voice would give us a reason for being.
And then?
And then, in our excitement, we dropped the receiver, disconnecting ourselves.
So does he come out the other side of this experience of virtual reality for the better, do you think?
I think it definitely changes him, doesn't it? But I don't think it's just the virtual reality experience. I think it's also his experience with Bob, because Bob changes him as a character as well, because Bob makes him go out in the real world and he's telling him all these things and sort of like how he should experience life and so on, go and grab things. So the virtual reality experiences are sort of like offering him that safe space, and he is developing emotionally with Bainsley, but at the same time, all of his real world interactions with Bob are also sort of like changing his character and making him open up more, to the point where he orders a pizza, which is something he would never do because he only has like certain things that he's allowed himself to eat.
Yeah, things that have no flavour. Yeah, no, you're right. I hadn't actually thought of it like that. I kind of thought that he was able to do that with Bob because of the connection that he'd made with Bainsley. But I think you're totally right. It's the two things are happening simultaneously for Cohen. And it's the human connection in the VR world, but also someone in the real world forcing him to experience the real world. It's those two things converging to somewhat resolve his existential crisis.
Yeah, because like it looks like he's on the right path, doesn't it, throughout the film? Because he's gaining all these different experiences. But he is also sort of like built up another connection with another character who is also in virtual reality. So he's got this character played by Tilda Swinton, the Shrink Rom, which constantly pops up and tells him how he's doing. What did you think about that aspect? And again, it's like another VR constructed person.
Yeah, he's got a virtual psychiatrist who is giving him therapy just through his screen. Again, it was interesting because of how it relates to the real world now and the way that the pandemic has shifted the way people experience therapy. I don't think remote therapy was as much of a thing. I think it was a thing, but not as much of a thing as now when people are having to interact with their therapists over Zoom calls or whatever. So it had that interesting tone to it. Like it should have been more alien, but it wasn't because of the world of 2020, 2021.
But it's slightly different though, isn't it? Because it's a artificial shrink. It's an artificial psychiatrist who's giving this information. And there's moments when he has to reboot her because she said the wrong thing. So it's kind of this unreliability of this information he's being given from her. So that kind of like changes the aspects of that a bit, doesn't it?
I kind of think it shouldn't matter that she's a virtual therapist if the quality of the therapy is good. But I guess the point is that she is hackable and subject to manipulation, and also provided by the, less than trustworthy management who has his own agenda and wants something out of Cohen working on the Zero Theorem. So yeah, she's subject to all of these external pressures, and the quality of the therapy she's providing might not be quite up to scratch.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things she does is just rap at him for a little bit, which is an amazing scene, but probably not that helpful for his condition.
Shut up and listen. Yo, you cannot, will not help you, Q. We do want to help you in it too, but we won't help you get your call. We will not help you, not at all, until you first shed verbal trust. First person plural, Q's at us. We got a plan for your sure cure that gives you singular.
But that's when she's been changed by Bob, isn't it? Bob's had a little go at hacking at her and messed up her programming.
Maybe?
I think so. I don't know.
Maybe I lost track of that point.
I lost a bit of track in this film as well. That's fine.
But that's it, because it's like, it is so sort of like, it's quite cerebral, isn't it? You have to think about what's going on, and it's not your straightforward like drama or anything like that. It's the word of Terry Gilliam. It's a bit offbeat. There's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of comedy stuff in there as well. You've got weird, quirky characters like the two people which come to fit all the computers, like they're clones, and one's tall and one's small. And it's like all of this weird stuff's thrown in to sort of just add to the absurdity of it all.
Yeah, and a richness of futuristic tropes, I guess, and dystopian worlds. Yeah, I mean, speaking of like that, it does sort of defy understanding. I have to say that towards the end of the film, I really didn't know what was going on in terms of him uploading his consciousness to the VR by accident. Is that what happened?
Yeah, it all gets a bit mad, doesn't it? Because so Bob basically presents him with this new suit where he's supposed to be able to connect to his soul so he can kind of like understand himself a bit more, because we haven't really talked about what the Zero Theorem is and what they're trying to prove. But The main purpose of that is to prove that everything in the world is meaningless. There is no reason for anything. Like, the Zero Theorem is basically there to prove that there's no reason for existence, there's nothing afterwards, there's no point. So management wants to prove that there is nothing. Whereas Cohen is such a man who wants purpose. He wants to sort of find out about himself. He wants a calling. He's got this faith. So he's given this opportunity to connect with his soul via the VR suit. And he chooses to use that after what I think is the moment where he gets his sort of like his calling, his moment. So Bainsley pops up in the church, his house, and says, oh, I was sort of like, I was working for management, but I thought about it and I want to run away with you. So he's given that moment of choice. Like, okay, hello, destiny's calling. You can go off with this woman now and live like a beautiful life.
Yeah.
But he doesn't, does he? And after that, he chooses to sort of like try and find out what his calling is, what his purpose is, by using this VR suit to do this weird thing where he's supposed to connect with his soul.
But he just gets like an electrical shock.
Yes. So at that point, it's really like, what is going on? Like, has he died? Or is he sort of like, is he talking to himself? Is he having like a moment of clarity where he's sort of like figuring all of this out? Because it's all quite bleak, this idea that management want to prove that there is no point to existence.
Well, it's even bleaker than that, isn't it? That he wants to prove there's no point to existence, but also specifically to monetize the fact that there is no point to existence.
Yeah, he's looking to make money out of it, isn't he? And like, that completely takes away from everything that Cohen's been looking for in his life, because he is such a worker drone, isn't he? He's sort of like, he does nothing but work. He doesn't live his life to the full potential. So when he's faced with this reality of what his job is and sort of like the fact that he's missed his chance with Bainsley, he has that big chat with management, but then he decides to fall into the void, doesn't he? Because he's kind of given up. He's like, this is it now. Like, my life was for nothing. He's realized that at the end, so he can't do anything about it. So he just lets himself fall, which is just... it's really sad.
Yeah, really sad that he's choosing to disappear off into a VR world, somewhere between his terrifying black hole and the idyllic beach that Bainsley created for him, but like a very notably empty beach that is missing Bainsley. There's remnants of her bikinis lying on there, the half-eaten picnic that they enjoyed together, it's all there, but she is gone and he's just standing naked in the ocean. It's very sad.
And like, you hear Bainsley's voice at the end, but you know that's not the real Bainsley. He missed his chance to go off with her into the sunset. So it's kind of like, it's either his memories of her or something like that. It feels more like that kind of ending to it.
Well, I think he's voluntarily trapped himself in a virtual reality, and he has some degree of control over it, the same way that he was able to manifest the black hole. He's now manifested the beach, but he's, I guess, choosing not to manifest Bainsley. But you're right, we hear her voice over the credits. So is he now creating her or just remembering her? It's very unclear.
Yeah, and it says a lot about what Terry Gilliam's trying to like say with this film as well, doesn't it? Because he is trying to make the point that you shouldn't wait for things to happen, because if you do, you're going to miss the opportunities that do come about when they do. So like, Cohen spends his entire life just waiting for this mysterious call to know what he's supposed to do and to find out what's next for him, but it never comes. And because he's so focused, so fixated on that one thing and all the other possible things that are going wrong, that he doesn't take the opportunity when it comes about to actually live.
Yeah, and I think the real tragedy of the movie is that he should be on the cusp of understanding that when the opportunity to live happily ever after with Bainsley presents itself. He's ordering pizza. He's referring to himself in the singular first person. He's developed and he's made these connections with Bainsley and Bob, but then he just chokes. He just chokes at the critical moment when he could leave this miserable life, determining there's no purpose to life, and go off and create some purpose with Bainsley. But he hasn't quite developed and reconnected with the world enough to be able to do that in that moment. Because
he's getting a sense of personal identity as well, isn't he? He's getting that individuality which the strangers were so obsessed with trying to find the whole time. He's getting all of that kind of stuff about himself, but it just comes at the wrong point. So he's no longer a we, he's no longer every other worker. He is a person. He has these sort of like wants and feelings, but it doesn't quite manifest.
Yeah, it's a tragic ending, isn't it?
But I think it's important that sort of these films exist, though, to sort of make these comments, because they are sort of commenting on, well, Gilliam is sort of saying, like, you shouldn't be so obsessed with work that it comes before everything, and you shouldn't be so fixated on waiting around for this one special moment that will change your life. You've got to sort of like go out and do things.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong message. I really liked the film. I mean, how did you find it overall? Had you seen it before?
No, this was the first time I'd watched it. So, like, obviously you could tell by the way I'm talking about it, I enjoyed it, because like I'm going into all these sort of like big speeches about sort of what the meanings are. I can see why some people would have difficulty with it. And it's not a film for everyone. Like, Gilliam stuff is not for everyone. It's sort of like, it's an acquired taste, but it's a taste I've definitely acquired.
Yeah, me too. I'm really desperate to watch this one again and just like sink my teeth into it again and try and wrap my brain around it. It's not as straightforward as 12 Monkeys. It makes 12 Monkeys look incredibly linear and just naturalistic, I guess.
Which is a mad thing to say about 12 Monkeys, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just a very Gilliam film. But I mean, overall, I don't think it's as good as 12 Monkeys or Brazil. I think they're better dystopian films. I think it's really interesting that this week we've watched two films that are really, really great, but have these similar films overshadowing them that were better, And these films tend to get forgotten. People don't have time to watch every film ever created. So it's easier to watch The Matrix and then not catch Dark City, which is what I had done until this point. It's easier to enjoy Brazil and 12 Monkeys, and then you hear that Zero Theorem wasn't as well received. So I just won't bother with that one. But they're so rich and there's so much to enjoy, and they're really compelling films.
Definitely. And they've got such interesting themes, and the way that they both deal with this sort of like questioning of reality is really interesting, isn't it? And it's so essential to what we're looking at in virtual reality, because it's not just about being stuck in a computer or going into this virtual world. It's about how that's affecting the people and how it affects memories and people's identities. All of that stuff is thrown in, and it's so fundamental to these science fiction films we've been looking at.
There's so much more going on in virtual constructed realities, and there's different ways that they can be presented on screen as well, isn't there?
Yes, which is exactly what we're going to be looking at next week on the show when we look at controlled reality. So it's something a little bit different, but I think it's an important thing to put into this series. So what films are we looking at to explore that theme next week, Matt?
So the constructed and controlled realities that we're looking at next time on the show are The Truman Show from 1998 and The Stepford Wives from 1975.
Yes, so not exactly the first thing you would bring up when you're talking about virtual reality, but I think they have a lot of similarities in what they're saying, and they've got characters which are in worlds which have been constructed purposefully for them. So it's going to be interesting to really dive into those next week.
In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us at journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or if you check out Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, search us there, you'll be able to find us and connect with us.
If you're looking for more Journey Through Sci-Fi content, we are also on Patreon. We have bonus episodes coming up on there regularly, so you can come and donate a small amount to the podcast to keep us running, and you'll be able to access all of that exclusive content.
If you don't want to do that, but you'd like to support us, we would welcome a nice review. If you want to do that, you can leave us a review and let us know just what the hell was going on in the Zero Theorem. That'd be really helpful this week.
Yes, please do. That's it from us. We'll see you next time.